A shocking report calls out the countries and companies supporting Myanmar's brutal military rule. The junta is producing weapons with imported parts used to commit human rights atrocities, while the persecution of the Rohingya continues. 2 years after the military takeover, can anything help Myanmar's civilians? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Myanmar. In spite of heavy sanctions since a military coup 2 years ago, Myanmar's Tatmadaw is producing a huge number of weapons to use against its own people. A new report by former UN officials says at least 13 countries are supplying weapons, parts for weapons, or machinery to produce weapons in Myanmar. The country has been engulfed in violence since February of 2021, when democratically elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi was deposed. Officially, more than 2,600 people have been killed since then. But the real death toll is thought to be at least 10 times higher. And UN figures show Rohingya attempting to escape an ongoing ethnic cleansing campaign that the UN calls a genocide have increased dramatically. In 2021, 700 people tried to flee by boat. Last year, that number rose to 3,500.
The movements that we're talking about today, they are of Rohingya refugees. They're refugees that require international protection. They should not be deported. They should be provided with protection and assistance. So we're urging on states to ensure that they abide by their international legal obligations in disembarking them, rescuing them at sea, disembarking them, and then ensuring that they're protected and not returned to situations of danger where their lives may be at risk. We're hearing reports, as we mentioned, from Rohingya about this growing sense of desperation and this anxiety about the future, and really the hope for security, for protection. Some of them are willing to unite with family members. Others, their vulnerabilities are being exploited by traffickers or smugglers, luring them with false promises and false hope.
Well, questions are being raised as to why the international community is not doing more to help civilians. Experts say that the UN has proven they can act in a crisis, as they did in the case of Ukraine. So why have they failed in Myanmar? Well, despite Western-led sanctions intended to isolate the military, a report by former UN officials says the US, France, India, Singapore, and even Taiwan are among those allowing their industries to supply weaponry to the military. None of the weapons produced, as a result, are used to defend its borders. Instead, they're used to suppress the population fighting against the junta's rule.
The leader of the Myanmar military, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and his top military leaders must be held accountable for the human rights violations that they have perpetrated. However, this report emphasizes that concrete action must also be taken to address the corporate responsibility to respect human rights in Myanmar. This requires action both by the companies that have been identified in this report and by their home governments.
Well, to talk more about that report on global firms supplying Myanmar's military is the report's co-author and the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar, Yanghee Lee. Thank you so much for being with us. You know, if we look at what actually led to this investigation, was there a realization that in spite of some pretty tough global sanctions, Myanmar's military not only maintains control, but it continues to commit atrocities unabated with a full arsenal of weapons?
Absolutely. The Security Council never issued a global arms embargo against Myanmar military. However, different countries have conducted their own bilateral arms sanctions. But we see many of these atrocities that are being committed by the military, the Tatmadaw. They are using homegrown, home-produced weapons, but many of the raw materials are being supplied by international companies.
Are those companies and those countries selling parts to Myanmar, are they fully aware that, you know, what they're selling is being used to manufacture weapons for the Tatmadaw?
Well, I can't speak for those companies and the states, but it sure does seem that way because it is being produced. I think the companies and the countries that are home countries, they have not complied with their international obligations, the human rights, business and human rights principles. Every country and every company has to do its end result risk assessment before they supply anything. Of course, there's been engagement with the Directorate of Defense Industries of Myanmar for many decades by different companies and from different countries. This was during the periods when the military junta was ruling over the Myanmar for decades. So they pretty well knew what was happening. And there has been many technical transfers from different countries too. And sometimes they use a country to send supplies where it would be serviced and then it will be sent back to Myanmar.
Right. So it's not kind of an innocent failure of due diligence here.
No, don't think so.
Then tell me personally, in this investigation, what really shocked you the most about what you discovered?
What shocked me the most was that there were so many countries involved and so many companies that were producing raw materials, or were supplying raw materials. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And the recommendations of this report are targeted on the in-country production of weapons with the explicit intention to disrupt its access to the weapons it uses to commit gross human rights violations, in line with the three-cut strategy that myself and my two other colleagues who formed the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar have been calling for. The three cuts is cut the cash, cut the weapons, and cut the impunity. The cut the weapons and cut the cash kind of fall together with what the part of this report.
Okay, so why haven't the sanctions been more comprehensive? Is that intentional?
Well, unless you have a Security Council sanction, which is targeted for a global arms embargo and dual-use objects too. Let's not forget the dual-use objects and jet fuels. Still there's going to be some gaps. Now, Myanmar, since 1950, Kapasa, this company that's producing these companies that are producing its own materials, have been operating since 1950. And Myanmar has had resolution after resolution for decades. And they've had different sanctions, and different countries have produced sanctions against Myanmar and armed sanctions. So they had to evade all of this. And so they had to make their own light arms, small arms, and munitions. And we have even seen verified aerial footage of, remember in 2017, the Indian massacre, many of the artillery that were used were produced by the Kapasa during those genocide. And currently in Saigon, which recently, some of the landmines and artilleries that are being used have been produced. We've been able to trace back the serial number to the Kapasa, different Kapasa factories.
Let me ask you at this point, though, is it almost too late for real sanctions to make a difference, given how self-sufficient Myanmar has become in its own weapons production?
Myself and previous special rapporteurs have all shouted for more targeted sanctions, especially arms embargo, but the Security Council never budged. And we call for stricter resolutions against Myanmar when it was committing genocide against the Rohingyas. Now it's doing the same thing against its own people for the past 2 years. And it has now totally emboldened the military. It is not too late. We have to cut the jet fuels. We have to cut all the raw material supplies that are going in and cut the cash. dealings with the Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited. Some companies are still doing business with the major companies of the oil and gas and electricity, etc. So we have to cut the cash and we have to cut the impunity.
Okay.
I just want to say something. Many of the narrative is that the military takeover. The military has not taken over Myanmar yet. It's trying to for the past 2 years. The Democratic Revolutionary Forces are fighting so bravely and so hard to push back. And we have just received some leaked information recently, and the international community have received it too, that many of the military that their bases are falling too, and the officers and soldiers are being targeted by the Democratic Revolutionary Forces, and they're falling.
Okay. So, I mean, how much hope should we have, or should you have in particular, that this regime can fall while there is still, I mean, even if we bring those sanctions to fruition that you're talking about, you still have China and Russia that can surpass most everything. So really, how realistic is it to think that this regime can fall?
Well, let's look at how the international community responded to Ukraine. It's shameful how it's been neglecting Myanmar we're going on 3 years now. And so if the rest of the world, let's leave out China and let's leave out Russia. Russia is busy now with its own war. And so I think if the Security Council can get their act together, finally, once and for all, and really espouse what they are supposed to be upholding, the UN Charter, then I think we have hope. I think there is hope for Myanmar as long as the companies are not getting these raw material supplies, and there is humanitarian assistance over the ethnic areas to support the ethnic communities and the central Myanmar communities too.
Asking the UN Security Council to get its act together, as you say, is a big ask, though. In the meantime, what do you want to say to the companies and therefore the countries that are actually supplying these parts and weapons? What's your personal appeal to them?
The companies have a moral and legal obligations, so stop it immediately. And for home countries to really regulate more. And, they are in breach of their international obligations. And therefore, these different companies and the home companies can be complicit to these horrific atrocities that we are seeing in front of our eyes daily in Myanmar for the 3rd year.
Okay. Yanghee Lee, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Thank you so much for having me.
So while the military continues its oppression, the exodus of the Rohingya community continues as well. For almost 7 years, the Muslim minority has been fleeing persecution in Rakhine State, while internationally backed efforts to assist and protect them have mostly failed. Joining me now to debate why are from London, former Australian MP and Doctoral Prize Fellow at Loughborough University, Ronan Lee. Also in London, founder and executive director of the Burma Human Rights Network, Kyaw Win. And from Bangkok, co-founder and CEO of Fortify Rights, Matthew Smith. Thanks all so much for being with us. We've been witnessing this ongoing atrocity for so many years, and we've addressed the fear of it losing the world's attention. Yet that seems to be exactly what's happened. Ronan, how bad is the situation for the Rohingya right now?
Well, it continues to be genocidal. I mean, let's call it exactly what it is. The situation within Myanmar for those Rohingya who remain in that country has been described by the United Nations investigators as genocidal. You've then got those who fled the country in 2017, living adjacent to the Myanmar border in Bangladesh, in the world's largest refugee camp complex, with really no meaningful future available to them. They don't know when they can go home. They can't settle in other countries. They can't settle in Bangladesh. It's an appalling situation for any human being to be living within. And I just don't see it improving until there's regime change within Myanmar. I mean, any sense of a positive future for the Rohingya, I think, really hinges upon regime change within Myanmar. When the military is in power within Myanmar, the Rohingya situation is always bad. But by no means their situation is guaranteed if there's change, but that's the best path forward for the Rohingya.
But Matthew, what about the role of the international community here and its failure? I mean, where were the biggest opportunities missed to help and protect this community, particularly as it had to flee Myanmar?
Well, thanks, Andrea. I think the most egregious failure at the international level with regard to the Rohingya population and addressing this genocide has, of course, been at the UN Security Council. China and Russia have consistently provided political protection to the military in Myanmar. There was a slight crack in that recently when the UN Security Council passed its first resolution on Myanmar in December, and China and Russia both abstained, which should send a loud message to the generals in Myanmar. That resolution, of course, did not mandate action, so in that sense, it was a disappointment. But it does demonstrate that the military's protection, political protection at that level, is not permanent. But over the years, of course, I mean, at Fortify Rights and our colleagues in the human rights movement and the Rohingya people themselves have been raising the alarm bells about the genocide for many years. And then now, of course, you've got populations throughout the country in Myanmar that unfortunately are experiencing directly the mass atrocity crimes by the junta. So governments need to do more, they can do more, and we're pressing on them to do more.
And Kyaw Win, I could see you agree that the genocide, as it was phrased, does continue. And some argue that it has actually gotten worse for the Rohingya, not least because Bangladesh's armed police battalion, and this is according to a very recent Human Rights Watch report, has also been committing extortion, arbitrary arrests, and harassment over the border in Bangladesh in the world's biggest refugee camp. Who is actually helping?
Thanks for having me today. I totally agree with my previous two speakers about their analysis. And when you see that you mean who helping is you talk about the Bangladesh government, or you talk about...
No, I'm asking, with all this failure to protect the Rohingya community, both inside Myanmar and in Bangladesh, who is actually helping? What has been done to help anyone?
Historically, this is the international failure. Rohingya, look at the result of the conditions of Rohingya people today around the world, not only in Burma, not only in the Bangladesh. You can find in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Thailand, and many countries, neighboring countries, even in Sri Lanka, Rohingya has been running away to save their lives, looking for, running away from the open prison in Rakhine state. People have, vulnerable, and their life has been necessarily they have lost so many lives in this process. And even in Thailand and in Burma, there are many thousands of Rohingya has been jailed for no reason, because for their just to escaping from the genocide. So we see that not only the international has been failed to address, to not only address, because international community also failed to sympathy the Rohingya people appropriately. For example, why these people has been jailed in Thailand? Why these people has been jailed in Burma? Right? So these so many questions arise here. And one of the biggest failure of this century is we allow this genocide to continue. And this military regime has been not only failure of the Rohingya genocide to respond. Now the military has more daring now to commit a crime against humanity across the country, which is so far, according to our BHRN report, we have recorded more than 3,000 people has been killed. These are the civilians, right? Shot dead by the military.
Ronan, we spoke a little earlier about how the international community has in a way proven that when it wants to be effective, it can take effective action, even when major players are not on message, as we've seen in the case of Ukraine. Why has this Rohingya atrocity been so badly ignored?
Well, it's a question of political will. I mean, ultimately, the United Nations Security Council has decided that they are prepared to tolerate and accept the mistreatment of the Rohingya, that they'll put up with that they're prepared to tolerate and accept the Myanmar military being in power and turning those same tactics that they've used against the Rohingya against the people as a whole in Myanmar. It's about political will. It's about the US, the UK and others on the UN Security Council deciding that they're prepared to tolerate that. Now, China and Russia, of course, provide an excuse. But I think it's time to see proposals put to the Security Council for a global arms embargo on Myanmar. I mean, there hasn't been an opportunity for China to say no to that. There's been back channel indications that they wouldn't support it. But let's put this on the table. Let's actually see some genuine intent from the major players at the UN Security Council. Let them do their job, and their job is to protect the welfare of people all over the world, including within Myanmar and including the Rohingya. So let's see a proposal for a global arms embargo, and let's see what happens with that.
Yeah, let's see. But Matthew, I mean, so far, have there been any examples set? Has there been any effective action that you can point to that's been taken?
Well, I think one thing that is very clear with regard to international justice and accountability is that it's incredibly slow. One thing that we are preparing at Fortify Rights, and I can share with you here today. Next week, we're actually going to be announcing that Fortify Rights and 16 individual complainants are going to be filing a universal jurisdiction complaint in a jurisdiction to be discussed next week. And this is an example of Rohingya survivors of the genocide coming together with others from throughout Myanmar to seek justice. But more to your question, it's been incredibly disappointing. There aren't even words to describe the disappointment in terms of the international community's failure to ensure justice and accountability. And also, I mean, the Rohingya have endured genocide. They've endured the worst atrocities. Ethnic communities throughout Myanmar for decades have been dealing with war crimes, crimes against humanity. And just to illustrate, we're talking about forced labor on the front lines. We're talking about beheadings, systematic rape of women. These are violations that have been happening in Myanmar for many, many years with total impunity. So not a single perpetrator from the Myanmar military has been held accountable. And that needs to change. And so with my colleagues here, with Kyaw Win, Ronan, many other people are working day and night to try to make that happen. At Fortify Rights, we definitely want to see more take place.
Right. Kyaw Win, I mean, do you have some faith that legal action to be taken can prove any results?
Well, I have to talk a little bit more here. You see that the situation, the real problem on the ground is not just Rohingya now, right? Those who are Rohingya, of course, they are suffering heavily genocide. They're facing genocide, slow genocide, and several decades. Now, this genocidal operation is now expanding to the other different Muslim groups as well. For example, Muslims are not getting proper citizenship status in southern Burma. 70% of them lack of citizenships, and also many parts of Burma, Muslim community has been put into the systematic policies, that discriminative policies, that they are not getting equal rights. They've been discriminated in several layers. So we, minorities in Burma, religious minorities and ethnic minorities in Burma, facing day and night, everyday basis, we have been facing discrimination, persecution, violence by this military regime. And what international community doing is now is not enough. And then besides, you see that today the report came out from SACM that 45 international firms are now supplying weapons and technologies to Burmese military to commit genocide and crime against humanity.
We spoke about that at length.
Legal method is not just only for the military. Those who are supporting this military, those who are collaborating with this military, those who are complicit in the genocide, these the legal accountability need to expand, not just focusing on the military only.
Okay.
And that's what sanctions need to be expanded as well.
Ronan, very, very quickly, you still seem to believe, though, that the military will eventually face an internal state collapse. But does that mean that the military would collapse as well, or can they be there for the long term?
Well, that's the worst case scenario, is that the country would collapse. I mean, the economy is close to collapse as it is, but the worst case scenario is that the country would effectively collapse, but the military would stay in control, and that would be a disaster for the people of Myanmar, would be a disaster for the Rohingya as well that are outside of the country, and would be a disaster for the region and for the world. What needs to happen is that there needs to be an effort by the international community. This falls on the UN Security Council to change the regime in Myanmar, to get the military out of power. There was a democratic election in 2020.
Right.
We know who the people want in power, and it's not the military.
Right. Ronan Lee, Kyaw Win, and Matthew Smith. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I'd like to thank you all so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.